Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Days of Yore. Today, we'll be speaking about the South African War, also known as the Second Anglo-Boer War, which took place between 1899 and 1902. Specifically, we'll be talking about Miramichi's involvement in that particular military conflict, and in a special way, I guess, highlighting the participation by the former owner of Boers Island, Hubert Sinclair. My sources today come from the newspapers of the time, but also from other encyclopedic sources to provide context. And of course, as always, I'll let you know that I'm not an expert in this, and mostly what I'm presenting here is for narrative purposes. So, just as a very brief background, the Second Anglo-Boer War, as I say, took place between 1899 and 1902. It was a conflict between the British Empire and the two Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. These were inhabited by settlers who had descended from 19th century Dutch settlers who had come to South Africa and had steadily moved inward due to British encroachment in the subsequent decades. Now, this conflict was ostensibly undertaken in defense of British subjects in the two Boer republics. But in reality, the discovery of gold and diamonds in that territory also had a lot to do with it. And it caused a great deal of division in Europe, but also here in Canada as well, as there were many who felt that it was Canada's duty as part of the British Empire to rally to the aid of the United Kingdom. There was a feeling among some that Canadians should take up arms and assist in this military conflict. However, there were also quite a few people that felt that this was not something that Canadians should be involved in. This was a British conflict, and a conflict of questionable merit, if any merit at all. And so there was a feeling that perhaps we should stay out of it. And just as much as there were conflicts in Europe over whether this war was just, conflicts in Canada over whether or not this war was just and should be participated in, so too there were conflicts and controversies right here in Miramichi. So in 1900, Major Richard Maltby, he arrived in Newcastle to recruit volunteers. So the Canadian government had basically come up with a compromise. The government of Wilfrid Laurier said that people who wanted to volunteer and go to South Africa were certainly able to do that. So that meant that there would be no conscription, that only people that wanted to go and fight could do so. And so in 1900, as I say, men were going to be recruited. 14 horses were bought at that time, and 18 men joined up to go overseas. Now, this included 5 gentlemen from the Newcastle area, and I'll read their names. Sergeant Sidney Morrison, Dixon Dalton, M.B. King, George Russell, John Gallia. This also included 3 men from Fredericton, 2 men from St. John, and others from Moncton, Westville, Campbellton, and Dalhousie. So a varied group of individuals, all of whom received uniforms that day, from Major Maltby, and were feted that evening at a celebration at the Newcastle Town Hall before heading off to Halifax the next day to take ship and travel to South Africa. So one gentleman that attempted to join at that time was Hubert Sinclair. Hubert Sinclair at this time had been the owner of Boers Island since 1893, so for 7 years. He also wanted to join. Unfortunately, though he passed his medical exams, 18, I guess, was all that Major Maltby was looking for. And so he could not join up at that time. However, he did go to Sussex and joined up there. This is somewhat interesting because, as though obviously Hubert Sinclair felt strongly and was one of those who believed that it was his duty and his inclination to join and assist the United Kingdom in this war, his father felt very much the other way. Edward Sinclair was a major philanthropist here in Miramichi and also the head of probably the largest of the medium-sized lumber firms on the river. And he felt very strongly that this was not a just war. This was not a war for anything more than imperial aggression, and wrote articles in the newspaper in opposition to what this war was all about. So, just as we saw division here in the country, also in the community, but also here's division within the Sinclair family, father and son on opposite sides of this issue. Hubert Sinclair would travel to South Africa and would become part of E Battery of the Royal Canadian Artillery. While there, in May of 1900, and so that same year when he joined, in May of that year, the end of May, he took part in the Battle of Boers Put. And that particular conflict centered around a farmhouse. Now the British had taken up position at the farmhouse. Now it's believed that the British commander had arrived there believing that the farmhouse was a good place, was a comfortable place, so that he would basically be able to lodge there. However, it was not of very good strategic value because the farmhouse and the farm itself were surrounded by high bluffs, which the Boers knew well. The Boer commandos who arrayed themselves in those high mountains then were able to ambush the British early the next morning, using their height and their ability to fire down from the bluffs into and toward the farmhouse to their advantage. Eventually, the men of E Battery were able to bring their guns into action, their artillery pieces into action, and a counterattack by the British were able to see the Boers off. But the battle itself was certainly a defeat, with the loss of 23 men killed and 45 wounded. Now, Hubert Sinclair wrote to his mother, "The bullets came like hail, and it is a wonder more of our men were not killed." So again, you can imagine this was a very harrowing experience for a young man at this time. So Hubert at this point would have been only 22 years of age. So again, I mean, to be part of this conflict, Hubert would return home the next year in 1901. He would have the Queen's South Africa Medal and would receive a certain stipend from the provincial government for his service overseas. The provincial government had put forward $5,000 in support of the volunteers for the South African War. This represented about a sixth of their spending toward education. So for every $6 they were spending on education, they were spending $1 on these South African volunteers. So hopefully that puts that into a little bit of perspective. About $30,000 for education, $5,000 for the volunteers. So as we read through the coverage of the war in the 2 years after the Battle of Boers Put, we do see the Miramichi men featured somewhat prominently. So Sergeant Sidney Morrison and Mr. John Gallia distinguished themselves in a battle in 1901, a battle that lasted for 18 hours. Their commanding officer praised their bravery, and there were a number of other articles like this that talked about Miramichi men doing very dynamic things in this particular military conflict. On the other hand, there were coverage of those who were labeled pro-Boers, those people who felt obviously strongly against the war. Most of these individuals paid a high cost for their opposition to the war. Some lost their jobs, others were physically accosted in altercations with those who felt very strongly in favor of the war. The press at the time obviously supported this latter camp. Most of these folks who were in opposition were presented in a very negative light. The war came to an end in 1902, and a very costly war it was. So there were 270 Canadian deaths. 4 Canadians won the Victoria Cross, so the highest honor for British and Imperial military. 7,000 Boer soldiers died, as well as more than 20,000 civilians. Many died in the British concentration camps, which were brought into effect during this war in an effort to hamper Boer guerrilla tactics. These were poorly run camps, poorly provisioned, and sickness and disease moved through these camps, causing the deaths of a great many people. 22,000 British and Imperial soldiers lost their lives as well, alongside between 7,000 and 12,000 Indigenous Africans who were fighting in this conflict. So today we don't often talk about the Anglo-Boer War. Now that could be because of the distance of time between that particular conflict and the present day. It may also be because this war was certainly a war for imperial gain, and perhaps today we understand it much differently than we did 120 years ago. So I think we'll leave it there. Perhaps a more somber note, but certainly one that's worth remembering. Today, if I've done my calculations correctly, our episode will be airing on Christmas, so I hope you're spending the holidays with those nearest and dearest to you. Obviously this year that might be a little bit more difficult than in years past, but I certainly hope that you're having a good holiday season and a safe one as well. The Living Island will be here next week with Ken Walker, and I'm sure he'll have any number of interesting things to discuss with you at that time. I will see you again in the new year. The Days of Yore is a production of this channel and the Friends of Boers Island. If you'd like to support us, just consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and if you're so inclined, into visiting our Patreon page in the description below to support us in a monetary fashion. Well, if you have any suggestions, anything that you would like to see on this show, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, along with any other suggestions, comments, or queries. For the Days of Yore, I've been Dr. Sean McCarthy, and I gotta find my pipe. My pipe is in my pocket, so I'd like to bid you farewell for this year. I hope to see you again very soon. All the best.